Good evening, everyone. I'm Martin Madar. I was born and raised in Slovakia and have lived in the US for over 20 years. I've been at Xavier since 2013 and a parishioner at Bellarmine since 2015. It's good to be with you all. Let me first say what I have in mind for us this evening. So first, I will give my prepared remarks for roughly 30 minutes. Then we will break into small groups using the Zoom function called breakout rooms. We'll do that for about 15 minutes. And then in the remaining time, we'll have time for questions and answers. I hope that sounds all right. So let me now pull up my notes here so that you can follow along with a kind of outline. Okay. So I was told that the series of presentations that we are starting today were requested by senior parishioners who are eager for an update in theology. I prepared my presentation for people who have a personal memory of Vatican II or who lived through the initial phase of its reception and are therefore familiar with the basics about the Council. I want to say first that it's quite fitting to start these theological updates with the Second Vatican Council, since the Council remains the most determinative event in the life of the Catholic Church in our living memory. Whether we like it or not, the Council represents a turning point in the modern history of the Church. Vatican II had a greater impact upon the life of the Catholic Church than any other event since the Protestant Reformation. The main question that I want to address today is this: what is happening or what is going on with the Council today? But let me start with an overview. The Second Vatican Council, or Vatican II, was the 21st Ecumenical Council. The word ecumenical in this context means that it was a meeting of bishops from the whole world, not just from a specific geographical region. The council took place in 4 sessions between 1962 and 1965, and it issued 16 documents. On this much, perhaps all Catholics can agree. The rest depends on what one thinks about the Council. One can be a fan of it, or one can think that it was a mistake. And of course, there is plenty of room in between. I will be speaking as a critical fan of Vatican II. As those of you who remember the Council personally, you know that it came as a big surprise. When Pope John XXIII announced it in January 1959, few thought that there would be still another council. It was generally believed that after the First Vatican Council, which took place in 1869 and 1870, and after its promulgation of papal infallibility, the Pope and the Roman Curia would make all the decisions for the whole Church without a messy process that councils involve. Vatican II was also a dramatic event. Some thought that the bishops would come to Rome and simply put a stamp of approval on the documents that various preparatory commissions drafted. But that's not what happened. Many bishops were very critical of the documents that were prepared for their review and demanded that new drafts be composed. These new drafts were a result of tumultuous debates between the conciliar majority and minority. The final documents that the council promulgated were quite different from the initial drafts. Those who had some theological training noticed right away that the documents of Vatican II did not read like the preconciliar theological textbooks. The change could not be denied. One could not miss that the council deeply desired renewal and reform of the church. It was clear that the council did not want the church to do business as usual. So, in what areas did Vatican II effect change? I'm going to offer a few examples. The first one has to do with the assessment of the modern world. The council offered a different assessment of the modern world than was common at the time. Throughout the 19th century, and in some cases until the council, the leaders of the Catholic Church opposed such features of the social and political order as democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and religious freedom. These features of the modern world were labeled as liberalism and were condemned. Catholics that supported them and believed that they could be reconciled with Catholicism were labeled as modernists. But the council did not continue in this confrontational relationship with the modern world. Instead, it urged Catholics to enter into dialogue with it. Furthermore, Vatican II reversed the Catholic teaching on religious freedom from rejection to acceptance of it. Religious freedom is such a hot-button issue in our society today, and Catholic bishops are among the champions of religious freedom. I wonder, however, how many Catholics born after 1965 are aware that less than 60 years ago, the official Catholic teaching condemned the notion of religious freedom. I am speaking in rather broad terms here, but the fact is that the Council did not repeat the kind of condemnations of the modern world that were issued by Pius IX in the 19th century or Pius X in the 20th century. And so the Council offered a more positive and nuanced assessment of the modern world than Catholics were used to, especially with regard to its intellectual, social, and political aspects. Okay, now an example of the second area of change. The Council offered a different understanding of the Church than was operative prior to the Council. At the time of the Council, there were two dominant ways of thinking about the Church. The Church as a hierarchic institution or society, and the Church as the mystical body of Christ. This latter view was a recent development. It was given an official status by Pope Pius XII in 1943. Vatican II did not reject these views of the Council, but it did not accord them the dominant place anymore. The Council retrieved an ancient understanding of the Church that was sidelined in the second millennium. Vatican II presented the Church, first of all, as a mystery or sacrament. This means that the Church is a reality imbued with a hidden presence of God. It is, or certainly it should be, a sign, an instrument of communion with God and of the unity of the whole human race. The Council also spoke about the Church as the people of God, and it said that this people shares inequality based on baptism, which is common to all. The distinctions based on different charismatic and hierarchic gifts are secondary to this basic equality of all the baptized. The Council also described the Church as servant, as communion, and as a pilgrim people. This last idea is really important. The view of the Church as a pilgrim community that has not yet reached its destination allowed the Council not only to take a posture of humility, but also to acknowledge the possibility and the need of reform in the Church, something that would have raised eyebrows before the Council. The Council spoke about the laity in ways different than was customary. Before the Council, the role of the laity was to assist the ordained in their ministry, without abolishing the distinction between the ordained and non-ordained. The Council taught that the laity share equally with the hierarchy in representing Christ as priest, prophet, and king. And because of this, it is the laity's right and responsibility to be actively involved in the Church's ministry. The Council also taught that the laity are called to the same holiness as the ordained and the professed religious. Vatican II taught that bishops are not vicars or delegates of the Pope, but that together with him they share in the responsibility of governing the whole Church. This notion is technically called collegiality of bishops, or episcopal collegiality. And last point here about the Church is that the Council presented the Church as missionary in nature. The Church is not an end in itself. Its end is to serve God's reign in the world. Okay, now, third example of change that the Council brought about. It has to do with liturgy. The Council brought changes in the liturgy. It mandated a reform of the liturgy. I would say that if there is one thing with which most people associate Vatican II, it is probably the change in the liturgy. This change did not come out of nowhere. There have been some changes that took place during the pontificate of Pius XII. I'm talking about 1940s, 1950s. And the preconciliar Roman Missal was lastly revised in 1962, which is the year when the Council started. The bishops of the Council wanted the liturgy to be reformed. They believed that the reformed liturgy would be a major factor in the renewal of the Church. They desired that all the faithful would take active part in the liturgical celebrations. The bottom line is that the Council promoted the reform of the liturgy as the logical and necessary follow-up to its renewal in ecclesiology. By ecclesiology, I mean theology of the Church. It could not have done otherwise. How, for example, could the Council have spoken of the whole Church as the people of God, and then have allowed the liturgy to remain a ritual reserved to clerics in an unintelligible language with little or no meaningful role for the rest of the faithful? Another example of change. Vatican II offered a different understanding of other Christians and members of other religions. The Council urged Catholics to get involved in the ecumenical movement. This was in stark contrast with the official directives before the Council, which rejected the ecumenical movement. The Council also taught that the Catholic Church rejects nothing of what is true and holy in non-Christian religions, and that the Catholic Church has a high regard for the manner of life and conduct, the precepts and doctrines, which, although different in many ways from its own teaching, nevertheless often reflect a ray of that truth which enlightens all people. The Council urged Catholics to enter in discussion and collaboration with members of other religions. It also rejected the view that all Jews are responsible for the death of Jesus, and it deplored anti-Semitism. Okay, my last example very shortly has to do with modern biblical scholarship. Vatican II gave a green light to modern biblical scholarship. So these are just a few examples of changes that Vatican II brought about and that are part of its vision for the renewal of the Church. Those who were brought up as Catholics prior to the Council found these changes to be incredible developments. As an event, the Council had a tremendous effect. It was the first experience in the living memory of the Church of a collegial exercise of supreme authority in the Church. A Church which had often prided itself on its immutability was seen undertaking a thorough examination and self-criticism. Many of the typical Catholic attitudes and strategies were reviewed and challenged in the light both of the gospel and of contemporary needs. Before I continue, I want to say that while the points I just went over are examples of change, the Council did not just promote change. It also maintained a strong continuity with the Catholic tradition. This may seem like a contradiction, so let me explain. Vatican II retrieved many theological insights from the first millennium, which became forgotten or sidelined in the second millennium. And so while many of the changes I was talking about seemed like a break with the tradition, they were a break with a recent tradition. I mean, with Catholicism of the 19th century, the first half of the 20th century, and with Catholicism as it developed after the Reformation. But many of the changes which the Council brought about were actually in continuity with the early Church. Okay, so that's a quick overview of Vatican II. Now let's fast forward 50 plus years and ask, what is happening with the Council today? What's happening with the Council today? As I see it, we are at a strange place. I would say that we are at a crossroads. On the one hand, we are amid a new phase in the Council's reception, which is a good thing. But on the other hand, we are witnessing a serious opposition to the Council. And the Council's legacy is now at stake, perhaps more than it had ever been before. So I will now expand on these 2 points, and that will be the end of my remarks. So with regard to the first point, we are witnessing a fresh new phase in the ongoing reception of Vatican II. This new phase began in 2013 with the election of Cardinal Bergoglio from Buenos Aires as Pope. There have been several phases in the reception of Vatican II so far. Pretty much they overlap with individual pontificates since the close of the Council, with the exception of the pontificate of John Paul I, who was the Pope only for 30 some days, right? So the pontificates of Paul VI, I should say, John Paul II, and Benedict XVI represent different phases in the Council's reception. And now Pope Francis inaugurated a new phase in that reception. Perhaps you're not familiar with the word reception in this context, so let me explain. What do I mean by reception? Councils go on as long as there is interest in them. In other words, they last as long as they are being received, appropriated, and implemented. So reception in this context means appropriation and implementation of the Council. Councils do not end on the last day of the Council. like in our case, December 8th, 1965. After December 8th, 1965, the council entered a new stage, and that's the stage of reception. And the question is, where are we in that stage? Is that still going on or not? What I'm saying is that we can speak about a new phase in the reception of the council because we are witnessing something new. And this something new is that Pope Francis is giving new life to the unfinished business of the council. What he is doing could be seen as releasing the bold vision of Vatican II from captivity, where it found itself over time. Many see it that way, many don't see it that way. But I told you that I was a critical fan of Vatican II, so that's how I see it. Pope Francis is giving new life to the unfinished business of the council. It's as if he was releasing the bold vision of Vatican II from captivity. Those who are positively disposed to Vatican II sense from the words and actions of Pope Francis a revival of the authentic spirit of the council. They perceive the current Pope as reinvigorating that experience of the Church that people had following the reforms of Vatican II. So how is Pope Francis giving new life to Vatican II reforms? How is he doing it? He has been advocating a reform of existing consultative and collegial structures as part of his desire for a humble, listening, and discerning church. I said earlier that Vatican II taught the doctrine of collegiality, which means, I will remind you again, that all the bishops, together with the Pope as their head, are responsible for governing the worldwide church. The doctrine of collegiality and a few other things that the council said made it clear that Vatican II envisioned a church that was less centralized. This has not yet happened in our church. On the contrary, when Francis became Pope, the church was as centralized, if not more, than at the time of Pius XII in the 1950s. But the trend towards greater and greater centralization within the church seems to be finally beginning to reverse itself under Francis. That's because of the Pope's promotion of synodality. Synodality. From the day of his election, he has made it clear in word and gesture that developing synodality at every level of the church and episcopal collegiality within the hierarchy would be central to his pontificate. But it's not an easy task. It's an uphill battle in a church that has grown increasingly centralized and dogmatized. Francis has been relentless in trying to change this ethos and replace it with a culture of dialogue, with a culture of encounter, with a sound decentralization of power, and with his firmly stated conviction that there can be a healthy diversity in the church without threatening its unity. That's a very important point, because the turn to kind of greater centralization that happened in the 1980s was basically a response to the idea that if we have a less centralized church, we have more unity in the church. But Francis wants to maintain both. He wants to maintain diversity and also unity. That's a very hard thing to do. And one would think that with these kind of awesome claims that Christianity makes about God and how God is present to us, how God is salvation, that if anyone is able to maintain unity in diversity, that would be Christians. But I don't know if we can do it. I think I should explain two things before I go forward, namely that a synod, namely, what is a synod of bishops and what is synodality? So first, Synod of Bishops. At the start of the last session of Vatican II in the fall of 1965, Pope Paul VI established the Synod of Bishops. He established this as a permanent institution that would be convened or called into session periodically. The Pope established the Synod of Bishops to promote collegiality among bishops. Okay? So there is this permanent institution, permanent synod that meets on occasions, and it was established by Paul VI. It was supposed to promote collegiality among bishops. Now, what's synodality? Synodality refers to a mode of government. It refers to a mode of governance. It is the opposite of monarchy or one-person rule. Synodality means a mode of governance in which the whole church, laity and clergy, under the leadership of the local bishop or groups of bishops, discuss important matters and reach decisions regarding them. Okay? So synodality is about how church is church. It's about a mode of governance. It's not democracy, but it's not monarchy either. This is what Francis has been promoting, this thing called synodality. So far, he has convened 4 synods, 2 on the family, 1 on the young people, and 1 on the Amazon region. You can ask, what's the big deal? The big deal about synodality in Francis is in the procedural changes that he has made so far to the way the synodal assemblies deliberate. The changes allow for greater freedom of discussion that was common before. The big deal is also that fundamental to Francis's understanding of synodality is the principle that the whole church must take part in the process of discernment that guides its mission. So for Francis, synodality is inherently a process of listening. It is a mutual listening in which everyone has something to learn. And the Pope has been emphatic that the process of listening must occur at every level in the church, not only on the global level where the Pope's ministry lies, but also on the level of a diocese and on the level of a geographical region. There are at least 2 challenges to synodality as Pope Francis envisions it. First, a true transition to a synodal church depends in large part on how his fellow bishops are willing to accept and support the Pope in his initiatives. So far, unfortunately, there has not been much cooperation from fellow bishops, with the exception of bishops in Germany and Australia. And the second challenge to synodality, as Francis envisions it, is that the Synod of Bishops was really established to promote collegiality among bishops and not to foster the synodality of the whole church. And so the kind of synodal church that Pope Francis desires seems to require structural changes that go much further than allowing greater freedom of discussion at the synodal assemblies. And the real question is whether synodality requires new institutions, or if it suffices to make marginal changes in order to render the existing institutions more attentive. I will skip my second example here because we are, I'm taking more time than I thought I would, and I will just go to my conclusion. And in this conclusion, in a few words, I want to talk about the legacy of the Council and how this legacy is now at stake more than ever before. Why is it that the legacy of the Council is at stake more than ever before? I would say simply because of the nature of opposition to Pope Francis. The opposition is vocal and well organized. It includes cardinals and bishops. You may have heard that Francis has been accused of heresies, and was even asked to resign. Why? There are many reasons, but basically because he has changed the church's teaching and caused confusion among the faithful. Resistance to change in some circles is so strong that those familiar with the recent history of the church cannot resist to ask if the Pope's critics ever heard of the Second Vatican Council and about the changes it brought about. One does not need to know a lot about Vatican II to conclude that the changes that Pope Francis has made are minor in comparison to Vatican II. The criticism that he causes confusion among the faithful is also rather odd. Were Catholics less confused when the liturgy changed all of a sudden, kind of a thing? Or when the doctrine of collegiality was introduced? Or when the council taught that the church was supposed to enter into dialogue with modern world? Or were Catholics less confused when religious freedom became an official Catholic teaching after it was condemned for a long time? It's hard to imagine that the Pope's critics would not take the same stance toward the council that they take toward him. More and more it is apparent that the opposition to Francis is rooted in a misunderstanding and misrepresentation of both the council itself and even more of the significance of the popes who, like Francis, have overseen the implementation of the council. One of the principal narratives that Francis has overturned is the idea that his predecessors, St. John Paul II and Benedict XVI, deliver the final and definitive interpretations on all key issues that the council addressed. I'll repeat this again. One of the principal narratives that Pope Francis has overturned is the idea that his predecessors, John Paul II and Benedict XVI, have delivered the final and definitive interpretations on all key issues relating to the council. And what we are witnessing is that Francis is attending to some of the unfinished business of Vatican II. The council's legacy is now at stake, perhaps more than it ever had been before. Okay, so thank you for listening.